Hello everyone and welcome to our channel, Dr. Hamza Al-Kinani, and this is our monthly political dialogue. Welcome to a new interesting interview today, the Russia and Ukraine war. So, after more than 8 years of the invasion of Ukraine, has it become clear that the Russians last 10 months have moved to a military strategy called scorched earth policy? What did the two sides gain so far from this war? Is there any Russian, Chinese, and Iranian cooperation in Ukraine, or is the loss of the Russians and the continuation of the war beneficial to the Chinese in other counts, such as Eurasia and gas? Is the Ukraine war an important experience for Chinese so that they monitor the West moves and base their foreign policy decision on that, specifically with Taiwan? How do we evaluate the role of America's allies and their cooperation in the Ukraine war, especially Gulf states, India, and Turkey? We will discuss these important questions and more with a very unique and expert guest who will help us analyze that war politically and strategically. Retired Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, he has served in the United States Army for more than 38 years, former commander of U.S. Army Europe, and currently he is a senior advisor with Human Rights First, and also he is a senior mentor for logistics with the NATO. So my dears, welcome with me, the retired General Ben Hodges. Welcome, Sir Hodges, and thanks for being with us today.
Dr. Al-Kinani, thank you very much for the privilege.
Thank you so much to you too, General Ben Hodges. At the beginning of this interview, in the balance of profits and loss, from your viewpoint, what have the two sides gained so far from this war?
Well, Ukraine, of course, has gained worldwide respect for their ability, even though the Russian side had all the advantages. The Ukrainians have defended their country successfully so far. Resilience of the people has inspired millions of us. On the Russian side, and let me say that Ukraine has gained the possibility of recovering all of their occupied territory to include Crimea. Russia has gained nothing positive. They have become a pariah state. Over 100,000 of their soldiers have been killed. So much of their military has been destroyed. They've lost Europe as a gas customer. And I think they've lost credibility. Nobody believes anything that comes out of the Kremlin, including out of Minister Lavrov.
Sir Hodges, do you think after more than 8 years of the Russian war in Ukraine, as it became clear strategically that the Russians last few months have moved from the Blitzkrieg tactical to the scorched earth policy, a military strategy, as you know? And that they have no choice but to spread panic among the population?
So thank you for pointing out the fact that this war has been going on for over 8 years, that it did start back in 2014, not just this past February. I think that they realize that they are not going to be successful with a armored formation driving across Ukraine. They don't have the capacity to do that. And so their only chance to somehow get out of this disaster is to drag it out so long that the West eventually loses the will to continue fight, to continue supporting Ukraine. So that's why they're going after power grid, going after civilian population, trying to put refugees on the road into Europe, which will put pressure on European capitals. They're willing to spend the lives of thousands of soldiers who are not properly trained just to push them into the meat grinder in hopes of dragging this conflict out so that we would lose the will to support. And clearly, this is not working. We're going to hear tomorrow from the latest round of the Ramstein Contact Group a large amount of equipment that nations are going to continue providing.
General Ben Hodges, as you know, that 60 years have passed since the Cuban Missile Crisis, and now the world faces nuclear war again. It seems that Russian President Vladimir Putin is losing his battle in Ukraine, so he continues to escalate his threat, claiming that he may have to use nuclear weapons to protect Russia. The question is, would he really use nuclear weapons if he refused to accept his failure to invade Ukraine? Or is it a strategy of escalation and nothing else, and he will not break all taboos?
So we certainly have to take the risk or the threat seriously. They have thousands of nuclear weapons, tactical and strategic. He clearly does not care how many innocent people are killed, but I still think it's very unlikely that they would use a nuclear weapon. Number one, there's no battlefield advantage to be gained by using a tactical nuclear weapon. That would not change what's happening on the ground in any significant way. In the Cold War, the doctrine for using a tactical nuclear weapon was to use it to create a gap or an opening in NATO defenses, and then they would have Soviet units that were trained and equipped to operate in a contaminated environment that would then exploit that gap that had been created. In the situation now in Ukraine, there is no place to create such a gap, and more importantly, there is no follow-on force that's trained and equipped to operate in a contaminated environment. So it gives them no advantage to do this. And I believe that they believe President Biden's warning that there would be catastrophic consequences if Russia used a nuclear weapon. And so I think the general staff of the Russian Federation forces, people around Putin in the Kremlin, I think they believe it. And so if there's no advantage, then why would you risk that sort of outcome? And I think it's also important that President Xi from China and other world leaders have also communicated that to use nuclear weapons, to even threaten the use of nuclear weapons, is unacceptable. So that's why I think it's not going to happen.
General Ben Hodges, since the Russian has 1,000 of missile, tactical and strategic, you said you should face that threat seriously. Some observers said it is too early to know whether Russia will lose or win, because the war is not only a military affairs but also a political issue. So do you agree that Putin's speeches show he is not ready to lose yet and willing to move on as long as he can, as long as it takes?
I think you're probably right that he certainly, the Russians have not changed any of their strategic objectives. Now, as I said earlier, what they say has very little credibility in terms of how they try to twist who's responsible for all this, somehow characterizing that this is defense of Russia. And of course it's not. The safest part of Russia was the part that touched NATO or Ukraine before this conflict. So I think that the Russian side certainly has millions more people. They do have unlimited natural resources, but they don't have the will to fight. I mean, it's clear that the Russian people really don't have stomach for this. They are, or last September, at the first partial mobilization, 500,000 Russian military-age males left the country rather than joining the military. They don't want to be a part of this. Now, of course, you don't see protests in the streets like you do in other places, but I think this is a reflection on Russian society, but also a reflection on the enormous security infrastructure that President Putin has put in place. So it's a little bit difficult to judge what's actually going on inside Russia, how legitimate their support is inside of Russia. It's difficult to gauge accurately what does Russian society really want, really believe. So this could go on for the rest of the year. I think, actually, however, that the West, if we continue to support Ukraine with everything that we said we would do, and if we eventually get to the point where we're providing longer range precision weapons like ATACMS that can reach out and touch Crimea and make it untenable, I think Ukraine can liberate Crimea by the end of this summer, by the end of August. And that's the decisive part. After that, then the other parts will follow. Crimea is the decisive part.
Before we end this part, here is the last question. Previously, in one of your posts, you spoke about 3 stages through which Ukraine can regain its lands, and you set 6 months for each step. My question is, have there been any signs of those stages so far, and would the Russians give up easily?
Well, of course, they won't give up easily. I think that President Putin doesn't strike me as somebody that will say, acknowledge, hey, I made a big mistake, we'll leave now. I don't think that's going to happen. I think there are going to be forces inside the Kremlin that once Crimea has been liberated, which, like I say, I think happens by the end of this summer, then the things will happen that I can't predict yet. They're obviously in an autocratic government or society like Russia. There's no clear, smooth transition of authority. Who's the successor to Vladimir Putin? So I don't know how that's going to go, but I think we should be prepared for the possible breakup of the Russian Federation. I think you've got so many different ethnic groups there inside the Russian Federation. Of course, there will always be a Russian state, but I think I could envision some of the smaller states that are part of the Russian Federation seeing opportunity to finally decolonialize themselves, to break out from underneath Moscow's rule. I don't know exactly how that happens or if it happens for sure, but we should anticipate the possibility. And what are the implications? Control of nuclear weapons, control of energy infrastructure. There's a lot of money floating around in different places, and potentially there will be violence and, of course, refugees. So we need to think about those kinds of possibilities. We also need to think about what is Russia's place in the world after this? As I said, there will always be a Russian state, and they'll always have enormous amounts of natural resources. But it's kind of hard to imagine any of the current leadership being welcomed into international organizations or international venues and events. Now, I was the stages that you're talking about. Of course, this past summer, it was clear that Russia was going to culminate, that they would not be able to take Kyiv or do anything. So that's why they had to back away. we use the military phrase culmination. They had culminated. And that's why the Ukrainian general staff was able to launch a successful counteroffensive back in early September. So that's the phase we're in now. I had thought that the Ukrainian forces might get all the way to the 23 February line by the end of the year. They did in most places, but not down in but not all of it. So I was off there. I still believe that they will, in fact, liberate Crimea by the end of this summer.
You said Russian will not give up easily, but there is a weakness point. You spoke about the exposure of the inefficiency of the Russian military leadership in managing the war and what you called corruption in the Russian army. To what stage did this corruption reach? Can you talk to that, please?
So corruption has manifested itself in several ways. First of all, the actual size of the Russian military. We heard, we thought there was a certain number, but actually it turns out that number, the official number, is much higher than the actual number of soldiers they had, because this is a classical method of corruption, is to receive salary for 100,000 soldiers when in fact you only have 70,000, and so there's money that goes into people's pockets. I think we're seeing the effects of corruption on the quality of equipment that they have. Even though they spent a lot of money on modernization, it turns out that much of the equipment is extremely poor quality. The tires, that's the most famous example, tires coming apart, or soldiers deploying with rations that have already expired. The latest manifestation of corruption is the quality of ammunition that has been in storage. As you know, ammunition, artillery ammunition, it's not like a hammer where it can just sit there forever. It has a shelf life, and it has to be properly maintained with not too much moisture. It has to be taken care of in climate-controlled conditions. They haven't done that. And this is another way that people responsible for storage of ammunition have skimmed off money and not done what they're supposed to do. And so you don't have a quality control. Again, this is another part of the corruption. People get paid off to certify that something is being done according to specification. And then all you got to do is take a look at the house, the residence of Defense Minister Shoigu. Not too bad for a government employee. I mean, it's enormous. And so I think the corruption that permeates the entire ministry also leads to a carelessness, a disregard for human life, including of their own soldiers, a failure to properly equip and train and house their own soldiers. And it also, of course, is reflected in the corruption of the conduct of the soldiers, stealing washing machines and toilets from Ukrainian homes and shipping those back, or even worse, the murder and physical abuse of innocent people.
General, in the other side, some political experts said that the refusal of the United States to supply Ukraine with advanced weapons is considered as a kind of deception to prolong the war and exhaust and weaken the Russians. Accordingly, will the United States and its allies supply Ukraine with more advanced weapons, or will it be satisfied with providing a defensive weapon with limited impact? How to respond?
So the effect that you describe is probably happening, that Russia is expending so much money, ammunition, people, equipment. All these problems have been exposed, but I am very skeptical that was the aim of the aim of the United States or Western countries. I mean, there's too much money involved and too much at stake to have such a cynical objective. Now, I have to say that I am very frustrated that we have been so incremental in the provision of capabilities and weapons to the Ukrainian side. But I think this is due to an exaggerated concern by the administration that the Russians might escalate and use a nuclear weapon. President Biden has talked several times, no World War III, et cetera. And so I think because of that, they have been very hesitant, worried about escalation each time they would do something. What we have seen, of course, is after 11 months, every time we've added a new capability, there was no escalation because the Russians are unable to escalate. And so I think this approach has been unnecessarily incremental.
Now let's talk about the Iranian activities. National Security Council spokesman John Kirby said Iran provided missiles and drones to the Russians. And this violates UN Security Council Resolution 2231, which prohibits Iran from transferring missile-related materials, technology, and equipment abroad. So the question is, can Washington prevent Iran from transferring missiles and drones to Russia? Did really Russia benefit from the Iranian drones?
So two or three interesting aspects of your question. First of all, so far as I can tell, we have not been able to stop the flow of drones from Iran to support Russia. There may be things underway. Of course, I would not have access to that information. I don't know. I don't see evidence of it. But I don't know that. Obviously, I hope that we can stop or disrupt the flow of those drones because they are being used to kill innocent people. Secondly, I think that it's very interesting to me that Russia has to import drones from Iran. I mean, Russia does not have the technology and the ability to make these drones. These drones are effective, but they're not magical weapons. I mean, they're not such high technology that they could not be replicated inside Russia unless the sanctions are having such a great effect in Russia that they can't get the components that they need to make the drones themselves. And then, of course, the rest of the world has got to be taking a look at this and thinking, okay, Iran obviously is not doing anything to endear themselves to the rest of the world that would like to get back to the JCPOA, for example, a nuclear agreement, and then what they're doing internally, executing protesters from the past few months. These are all actions that I think only have a bad end for the regime in Iran, and hopefully the people of Iran will be able to recover their independence, their a way of life that's not under the total control of this murderous regime.
Sir Hodges, what about China? What is the Chinese position now on this war? And will China leave the Russian Federation to collapse easily without interference from its side? What do you think?
It's an excellent question. I'm not sure that China is an ally. You remember they were supposedly friends without limits. Well, obviously there are limits. There are limits. They are not providing, at least as far as we can tell, significant aid. The Chinese are quite happy to buy cheap Russian fuel, which does not really help the Russian economy. I think the Chinese are probably looking at the big stretches of territory of the Russian Federation that used to be Chinese. And so I would also, as we've already discussed, think that the Russians absolutely do not want, the Chinese do not want the Russians to use a nuclear weapon. There's nothing good for them. I mean, this war is hurting China from an economic standpoint because of the disruption of the world economy. And then finally, I think that Beijing is probably not real happy with Russia for starting this conflict. Because one of the results has been that the West is now awake. We're getting serious again about our allies, about defense industry, about building capabilities that would be needed if we ever got into a conflict with China. So this is probably another reason that the Chinese are not happy with Russia.
Let's talk about the oil and the US allies. As you know, since the beginning of the Russian-Ukraine war, the news have not stopped talking about the energy crisis, which was linked to the developments of the war. Despite the pressures that Saudi Arabia and its oil-producing allies were subjected to at the beginning of the war, as the largest exports of crude oil in the world. The question is, how can USA and its allies use the price-reducing weapon against Russia, especially with the OPEC Plus decision and policies?
So this is an area where I'm not expert. So I don't have too many insights about world oil markets and how to leverage that. But let me say this: the Russians played the gas card, the energy card, way too early. Because they did it so early. Germany, I live here in Frankfurt, Germany. Germany had time to go out and find other sources, and so that actually by November they were at 100% storage capacity filled. So they had found other means and had completely ended their reliance on Russia for gas. And the attitude here in Germany changed significantly. You could hear it back in the summer, people were worried, but by the fall, people were only angry at Russia. You didn't hear people being worried anymore because they saw that their own government had taken steps, and also people realized what was at stake here and started doing things to reduce their dependence on gas and oil. Here today, it's the 19th of January, 19 January, and the temperature in Frankfurt is 0. This is one of the first days it's been this cold yet. So it's been a very, very mild winter as well. So I would say that Russia's attempt to use gas as a weapon has backfired. They've lost customers. There used to be Germans would always say, look, the Soviets and then the Russians were always reliable gas, no matter what else was going on. Obviously, that's gone forever. And it's created opportunities for other countries to step in and fill that gap.
Since we mentioned U.S. allies, how do you evaluate the role of America's allies and their cooperation in the Ukraine war, especially Saudi Arabia, India, and Turkey? Is this a time to win allies and lose others?
Well, President Biden emphasized the importance of allies on day one. In his speech at his inauguration, he talked about allies and the importance of the United States, of us living up to our own values so that we could regain the trust of our friends and allies around the world. And I think he's done that. He's made that a priority. He and Secretary Blinken. The United States does not have the capacity to do everything it needs to do by itself. We need allies. I don't mean just Army, Navy, Air Force type allies. I'm talking about friendly territories to help with all the issues that are out there: protection of human rights, energy, the cyber, counterterrorism. There's so many areas where you need to have friends and allies to protect this international rules-based order, freedom of navigation, respect for sovereignty of international borders. You need allies. And so I think you're not a good ally if you just call up when there's a problem and say, "Hey, I need you to do something," or "Can you do that?" That doesn't work. And so the countries that with which the United States is working hard to rebuild relationships, they need to be confident that the U.S. is always going to be an ally for them, not when it's convenient or not when it's an emergency. Exactly. And here, I think India and Turkey are two examples where we have not been consistent in our relationships. Same with Saudi Arabia. I think many states feel that it was transactional, particularly during the Trump administration. And so we've got to get back to that. Turkey in particular, as a NATO ally, is so important. I don't excuse any of the bad decisions that Ankara has made or how media are treated there, but that map is never going to change. And so we need to have a relationship with Turkey where we understand and respect their security concerns, and that they are confident that we will always be their ally, even when we disagree on certain things.
Fair enough, General Ben Hodges. In your opinion, what will Putin do in the coming months?
I think he's going to try and do everything he can to extend this conflict, to try and break the will of the West to continue supporting Ukraine. So he's going to waste the lives of thousands more Russian men, and I just don't see any bright light on the horizon for the Russian Federation. There's the will of the West to support Ukraine seems so strong. It's not going to last forever, but I think that we're approaching a part of the war now. Where
did you have any opinion about the former Wagner that he's seeking asylum these days?
I think so. You're talking about the former Wagner commander, yeah. I don't know anything more than what I have seen on social media, but I'm sure that guy's life is at huge risk. But he also will be important his testimony will be important when the war crimes begin. The War Crime Tribunal and indictments start coming out for people like Mr. Prigozhin and everybody above him. These kinds of testimonies will be important for their trials.
General Ben Hodges, a final word to our channel and its followers.
So I think that people have to be informed, and they have to take responsibility for informing themselves. So what you're doing is providing an opportunity, Dr. Hamza, for people to try and understand what the big issues are that are affecting us. So I'm grateful for the opportunity that you have given me.
Thank you to you too for the opportunity that you give it to us. At the end of our meeting with you, thank you so much, former General Ben Hodges, for your time and expertise. We hope to meet you again in other interview. Thank you so much to you as well, our dear followers. Until we meet again, here's Hamza al-Kilani to enrich the mind, not to arouse emotions.